Victoria Malone had never bothered much for what the neighborhood thought of her. While others in the gated community spent their weekends hosting outdoor parties and bickering over lawn decorations, she was busy fortifying her home. Not in some paranoid doomsday planner's way, but because she believed in self-sufficiency. After years of working as a private security consultant, training corporations on how to safeguard their assets, strengthen perimeters, and anticipate threats, she had developed a mindset that most suburban residents simply couldn't understand. It wasn't about fear. It was about preparedness. Her house, a simple but solid two-story structure, sat at the edge of the neighborhood, right against an area of thick forest that most residents avoided. The land had a unique feature that had drawn her to it when she first moved in, a decommissioned Cold War period bunker buried deep beneath the property. It was forgotten history, a relic of an era when people had believed nuclear war could come at any moment. The original structure had been reinforced decades ago, but Victoria had upgraded it, modernized its technology, and turned it into something more than just a relic. Unlike her neighbors, she didn't rely on the city's fragile infrastructure. She had her own solar power network, backup generators, and a deep well that ensured she had water even if the rest of the grid collapsed. The bunker wasn't just an afterthought. It was a fully functional underground refuge, with months' worth of supplies, filtered air, and a security system that rivaled high-end establishments. She didn't advertise its existence, and most of the community remained unaware of how prepared she truly was. But if anyone ever tried to trap her, they would quickly learn that Victoria was not someone who lost easily. The people running the neighborhood association, however, had long disliked her autonomy. They preferred obedience, control, and conformity, and Victoria was the opposite of everything they stood for. She refused to attend their meetings, ignored their endless notices about community guidelines, and openly challenged their absurd attempts to dictate what she could do with her own property. She had bought this land outright, with no debts, no shared obligations, and no intention of ever bending to their ridiculous demands. The worst of them all was Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. A woman whose authority was based entirely on the fact that she had nothing better to do than meddle in other people's lives. She was the type of woman who would threaten a lawsuit over a mailbox being the wrong shade of beige, or harass a single mother because her kid's bike was left on the sidewalk for 2 minutes. Karen believed in control, but only when she was the one defining it. Victoria had made the mistake of underestimating how spiteful Karen could be. It had started with fines, arbitrary penalties for nonsense like excessive vegetation in her backyard and unauthorized changes to her garage. Then came the passive-aggressive threats, letters implying that her property might be subject to review or that the community reserved the right to enforce certain regulations. Victoria ignored them. She wasn't a fool. She had read every line of the agreements when she bought her home, and she wasn't bound by any of their so-called rules. Karen's frustration boiled over when she realized she couldn't force Victoria to comply. And when the news broke that a Category 5 hurricane was heading straight for them, Karen saw her opportunity to strike. The storm was being called one of the most destructive in recent history, with winds exceeding 160 miles per hour and an expected storm surge that would flood most of the coastal regions. The governor had issued mandatory evacuation orders, and the city was in full panic mode. Supermarkets were emptied, gas stations ran dry, and people who had spent their entire lives trusting the system suddenly realized that the system was not prepared to rescue them. Victoria, however, had been prepared for this for years. She had more than enough supplies, power, and infrastructure to endure the worst of it, and she wasn't about to waste hours sitting in traffic trying to flee when she had a bunker built to withstand disasters just like this one. She watched as her neighbors frantically boarded up their windows and packed their SUVs, but she simply locked down her home, activated the secondary power grid, and secured the bunker entrance. Then, just as she was about to descend into the shelter for the night, she saw movement on her security screens. At first, she assumed it was just stragglers leaving the neighborhood, but when she zoomed in, her stomach tightened. Karen was there, along with several other members of the community board, and they were walking straight toward her house. They weren't just checking on her. They were coming for her. Victoria switched to sound surveillance and immediately caught the conversation. "She's still here? One of the men whispered. I told you, Karen hissed. She's not leaving that bunker of hers. It's probably better than any shelter in the city. So what's the strategy? Another voice asked. Karen grinned. We're going in? Victoria's hands curled into fists. These people weren't coming to ask for help. They were coming to take what wasn't theirs. She switched the security feed to night vision. Karen and her people were already prying open the gate, forcing their way onto her property like thieves. They thought she wouldn't fight back. They thought she would be weak, isolated, defenseless. They had no idea what they were walking into. And by the time they realized their mistake, it would already be too late. Victoria didn't move immediately. She knew better than to react on instinct. Even though the sight of Karen and her people violating her property made her blood boil, rushing out in anger would only escalate things too soon. Instead, she took a deep breath, eyes locked on the security feeds, analyzing the situation the way she had been trained to in high-risk environments. Assess first, act second. She counted 5 people: Karen, her constant lapdog Richard, and 3 other board members she only recognized from previous conflicts over absurd neighborhood disputes. They moved with a mix of urgency and hesitation, the kind of nervous energy that came from people who knew they were doing something illegal but had convinced themselves they were justified. That was exactly what made them dangerous. Karen was leading them toward her house, motioning for the others to hurry as she whispered orders that were barely picked up by the microphones. They were planning something specific, not just a desperate attempt to seek refuge. Victoria's stomach tightened as she switched to the thermal cameras that covered the edges of her property. The storm winds were already picking up, trees bending under the force of the incoming hurricane, the air thick with tension. The city lights in the distance were flickering, a sure sign that the power grid wouldn't last much longer. Once the blackout hit, all hell would break loose. She turned her focus back to the intruders. Karen reached Victoria's back porch first, trying the door handle. Locked, she whispered something to Richard, who then pulled out a crowbar from his coat. Victoria's expression darkened. So that was the game. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a plea for help. This was a takeover. Karen and her little gang weren't just here to ask for shelter. They were here to seize it by force, believing that Victoria wouldn't be able to stop them. They thought they could just walk in, push her aside, and occupy her bunker as their own. Victoria exhaled slowly and flipped the first security switch. Outside, the exterior floodlights snapped on, blindingly bright against the pitch-black night. The group startled like cockroaches caught in the open, shielding their eyes, stumbling back. What the hell? One of them hissed. Karen recovered first, throwing a glare toward the nearest security camera. Victoria, she called, voice dripping with fake authority. This is ridiculous. You know the situation. You have a shelter. The whole neighborhood is evacuating, and we need somewhere safe to ride out the storm. Victoria took her time responding, letting them sweat, letting them know they weren't in control. She pressed the button for the external speakers, her voice smooth but firm as it carried through the yard. This is private property. You are trespassing. Karen scoffed, putting her hands on her hips like a parent dealing with an unruly child. Don't be dramatic, Victoria. We are your neighbors. This is a crisis, and we're acting in the best interest of the community. You're acting in the best interest of yourselves, Victoria corrected coldly. Leave now. Richard gripped the crowbar tighter, shifting uncomfortably as the wind howled around them. Come on, Karen, let's just know, Karen snapped, shooting him a furious look. She turned back toward the camera, stepping closer, her expression shifting from frustration to thinly veiled contempt. I try to be reasonable. I try to explain, but you've made it clear you don't care about anyone but yourself. That's not how a community works, Victoria. You don't just get to lock yourself away and let the rest of us suffer. Victoria almost laughed at the sheer audacity of Karen's words. She owed them nothing. Her voice remained calm, though her fingers itched to tighten into fists. She had spent years preparing for disasters, and now these people, who had mocked her independence, wanted to claim what she had built. She spoke evenly, letting every word carry weight. You have 10 seconds to get off my property before I take action. Karen narrowed her eyes, her mouth pressing into a thin line. You wouldn't. Victoria flipped the second security switch. A sharp mechanical clicking noise echoed through the yard as the exterior defenses activated. Metal barriers extended along the lower windows, reinforcing the house against forced entry. The electric locks on the perimeter fence engaged, ensuring no one else could sneak in from another side. The quiet hum of unseen servos adjusting security mechanisms filled the night air. Richard took an instinctive step back. "Karen, I don't think this is a good idea." Karen was too deep into her self-righteous delusion to back down. "Grow a spine," she hissed at him before turning back toward the house. "You are making a mistake, Victoria. You can't just cut yourself off from everyone forever. You think you're safe down in your little hole? You think your precious bunker makes you untouchable?" Victoria did not reply. Karen's lips curled into something cruel. "We know about it." For the first time, Victoria's pulse spiked. Karen smirked, recognizing the flicker of surprise in Victoria's pause. "That's right," she continued, her voice smug. "You think no one has been watching. We have seen you bringing supplies in, working on those home renovations you pretend are for your basement. You thought no one would notice how much fuel you have been storing, how much food you have been stocking. And you know what? We decided that bunker isn't just for you." Victoria felt a cold sense of clarity wash over her, the way it always did when situations shifted from minor threats to serious problems that needed solutions. Karen had made two fatal mistakes. First, she had assumed Victoria would ever allow herself to be bullied into surrendering. Second, she had announced, out loud, that she and her people had been watching her for a long time, documenting her every move. That wasn't just an invasion of privacy. That was a security breach. Victoria reached beneath her desk and pulled out her sidearm, a customized SIG P320, loaded and ready. She wasn't planning on using it yet, but the situation had changed. Karen and her people weren't just panicked neighbors looking for shelter. They were organized, deliberate, and had been waiting for the right moment to act. Victoria cut the exterior lights, plunging the yard into darkness once more. Karen's smugness vanished. "Victoria," she called, her voice suddenly uncertain. Victoria switched the external speakers back on, but this time her voice was ice-cold, devoid of emotion. "You should not have come here." Then she cut the feed completely, leaving them outside with nothing but the roaring wind and the first heavy raindrops of the hurricane slamming into the pavement. Karen might have thought she was in control when she stepped onto Victoria's property. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. Victoria kept her breathing steady as she watched the security feed, her fingers resting lightly on the grip of her firearm. The wind outside was howling now, tearing through the trees like an invisible beast, and the first sheets of rain lashed against the windows, turning the world into a swirling chaos of water and darkness. The hurricane was here, but that wasn't the immediate threat. The true danger stood just beyond her back porch, shrouded in shadow, caught between indecision and the arrogant belief that they still held control of the situation. Karen and her group had stopped whispering among themselves. They had gone silent, listening, waiting, straining to hear any sound that might give away Victoria's next move. She knew that kind of silence well, the kind that came before desperate action. Karen had spent the last few minutes spewing her self-righteous justifications, convinced that her moral superiority alone would force Victoria to submit. But now, as they stood drenched in the rising storm, as the lights of the house blinked out and left them exposed to the elements, the bravado was cracking, and desperation was creeping in. Richard stepped closer to Karen, leaning in to speak over the wind. "She is not playing around," he muttered, his voice barely audible through the static of the storm. "We should go before this gets worse." Karen's shoulders stiffened, her fingers curling into fists. "We are not leaving." She turned her head sharply toward the other two men, Frank and Jared, both of whom had joined this little coup under the assumption that Victoria was just another loner survivalist with more supplies than sense. But now they were glancing between each other, shifting uneasily, no longer as sure as they had been when they first stepped onto her property. "She is watching us," Jared said, his voice almost drowned out by the storm. He glanced up at the nearest security camera, its tiny infrared light glowing like an unblinking eye in the darkness. "She is waiting for us to make a move." Karen exhaled sharply, her breath turning into mist in the cold air. Then let's give her a reason to come out. She motioned to Richard, and before he could argue, she snatched the crowbar from his hands. Victoria leaned forward slightly, watching through the screen as Karen strode up to the side window and drove the crowbar hard against the reinforced glass. A sharp crack rang out, but the window did not shatter. Instead, it merely absorbed the impact, leaving only a faint spiderweb of fractures where the blow had landed. Karen did not hesitate. She swung again and again, frustration building with each failed attempt. Victoria did not flinch. She had expected this, but what Karen and her little gang did not know was that every action had consequences. Victoria reached for the control panel beside her, her fingers gliding over the cold metal buttons with practiced ease. She pressed the first trigger. Outside, the sprinkler system activated, but instead of water, thick plumes of industrial-strength tear gas erupted from the hidden nozzles along the perimeter of her home. Karen barely had time to react before the gas engulfed them, thick and suffocating, burning their eyes and lungs within seconds. She staggered back, gasping, her crowbar slipping from her grasp as she covered her face with her sleeve. But it was useless. The wind was against them, pushing the gas into their noses, into their throats, sending them into fits of violent coughing. What the hell? Frank stumbled sideways, blindly reaching for Jared as he choked on the fumes. We need to move, Jared wheezed, his eyes streaming as he clawed at the wet fabric of his shirt. Richard had already dropped to one knee, hands on his face, trying to wipe away the stinging chemical mist that clung to his skin. We need to get out of here, he shouted, his voice raw and desperate. Karen was gasping, gagging, but she still forced herself upright, rage overriding pain as she stumbled toward the porch, trying to find a way inside, trying to prove that she was still in control. Victoria exhaled slowly through her nose. She pressed the second trigger. The sprinkler system shut off just as suddenly as it had activated, cutting off the gas. Karen and her group were left coughing, their bodies hunched over, their clothes damp with sweat and rain. Their breathing was ragged, uneven. Their morale was breaking. Then Victoria turned on the external speakers again, her voice low, controlled, and unshaken. I warned you. Karen jerked her head toward the camera, blinded by fury and humiliation, her entire body trembling from the force of her coughing fit. You absolute. She coughed violently, her voice rasping. Victoria ignored her. If you leave now, I will not escalate further. Jared did not hesitate. He turned, nearly tripping over his own feet as he bolted back toward the gate, his hands still clutching his burning face. Frank followed, supporting Richard as they stumbled away from the house like wounded animals. But Karen did not move. She stood alone now, her breathing heavy, her rage boiling over into something unhinged. The storm raged around her, rain soaking her clothes, her hair clinging to her face like a veil. Her eyes burned, not just from the gas but from defeat, from humiliation, from the realization that she had lost control. Victoria knew exactly what that did to a person like her. Karen took one step forward, glaring at the camera. You think this is over? She spat, her voice hoarse and venomous. You think you have one? Victoria said nothing. Karen let out a low, hateful laugh. You can lock your doors, you can hide in your little bunker, but I know the truth now. She lifted her shaking hand, pointing directly at the camera, directly at Victoria. You do not belong here, and I promise you, I will make sure you never feel safe again. Victoria felt a slow, creeping cold settle in her chest. Karen was not just angry. She was unraveling. Then, just as suddenly as she had arrived, Karen turned on her heel and walked away. Victoria did not watch her go. She already knew what came next. This was not over. This was just the beginning. Victoria sat motionless in her control room, her fingers lightly resting on the arm of her chair as the security feeds flickered before her eyes. The storm outside was growing more violent, the wind howling like a wounded animal as it tore through the neighborhood, bending trees, ripping shingles from rooftops, and sending debris flying down the flooded streets. The world beyond her walls had turned into a chaotic, merciless force of nature. But it was not the hurricane that kept her pulse steady and her breath controlled. It was the knowledge that Karen was not done. She could feel it, a tension lingering in the air like static before a lightning strike. Karen had left, but she had not retreated. She had regrouped. Victoria switched through her security feeds, scanning the property for movement. The front yard was empty, save for the wind-driven sheets of rain hammering against the pavement. The perimeter fence stood untouched, its reinforced steel panels holding firm against the elements. The side yard was clear. The driveway was deserted. Even the backyard, where Karen and her people had staged their pathetic invasion, was now just a flooded mess of overturned patio furniture and scattered debris. There was nothing to indicate that anyone had returned. And yet, she knew something was not right. She moved her gaze to the far-right monitor, pulling up the motion-sensitive underground sensors she had installed along the northern side of her property months ago. A thin green line pulsed on the screen, the reading stable. No movement, no activity. But Victoria had lived through too many close calls in her life to ignore her instincts, and they were screaming at her now. Karen was not the type to take a loss quietly. She was the type to come back harder, meaner, more desperate. Victoria switched to the bunker's internal systems, running a quick diagnostic of the ventilation, electrical grid, and reinforced entry points. Everything was secure, but she knew that physical barriers meant nothing if you did not account for human nature. And Karen was dangerous because she believed she was righteous. Victoria checked the time. 1:42 a.m. The storm would rage on for at least another 6 hours, maybe longer depending on how the wind shifted. That meant Karen and her people had nowhere to go. They could not evacuate. The roads were impassable, the highways flooded, and emergency services were already stretched beyond their limits. They were trapped, forced to either hunker down or take what they wanted by force. She exhaled slowly. Then, without hesitation, she killed the external power to the property. The house plunged into complete darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of her control panels. Outside, the security lights cut off, leaving the entire lot blacked out, a void swallowed by the relentless downpour. Karen wanted to play games. Victoria was about to show her that she had stepped onto the wrong battlefield. She unholstered her sidearm, a Glock 19 modified for quick draw and reliability, and placed it within reach on the desk. She was not looking for a fight, but if Karen forced her hand, she would ensure that this ended on her terms. Then, just as she was about to cycle through the security feeds again, something moved on the far left monitor. She stiffened, narrowing her eyes as she zoomed in on the feed. At first, it was just a shadow, long and distorted by the rain and the intermittent flashes of lightning that illuminated the property in eerie white bursts. But then the shadow shifted, breaking into multiple shapes, figures crawling through the flooded grass, moving low to the ground, almost military in their precision. 5 of them. Her jaw clenched. Karen had not just regrouped. She had brought reinforcements. Victoria adjusted the camera angle, enhancing the image just enough to catch a glimpse of their faces. 2 were unfamiliar, strangers, most likely opportunists that Karen had convinced to help her. But the other 3, Karen, Richard, and the last one, a man she did not recognize but immediately knew was not from the neighborhood. His posture was different, rigid but fluid, the kind of movement that came from experience, not a random suburban idiot caught in a bad situation. This was someone trained. Victoria inhaled slowly through her nose, forcing herself to think, not react. If Karen had someone like him, then that meant she had resources she had not shown before. That meant she had planned this deeper than Victoria had anticipated. That meant she needed to move fast. Victoria shifted to the bunker's internal cameras, flipping through each one in rapid succession. Everything inside was as she had left it, sealed, locked down, untouched. But then a motion alert. Not from outside, not from the yard, from inside the bunker. Her muscles tensed, her eyes flicking to the small, blinking red dot on the screen. It was coming from the second access corridor, the one that led to the emergency exit hatch on the far side of the property. Her blood ran cold. They had found a way in. Karen was not attacking the house anymore. She was already inside. Victoria moved swiftly, grabbing her firearm and securing it against her thigh as she switched to the bunker's manual override controls. The emergency hatch had a fail-safe lock designed to prevent unauthorized access. But if Karen had discovered the old maintenance tunnels beneath the property, she could have forced entry without triggering the external alarms. That meant Victoria had minutes, maybe less, before they reached the main chamber. She stood, moving quickly but silently down the reinforced hallway that led to the bunker's lower level. The dim emergency lighting cast everything in a dull red glow, shadows stretching unnaturally across the steel walls. She reached the secondary security door just as she heard the first dull thud from the other side. They were already trying to breach it. Victoria adjusted her grip on her weapon, her heartbeat steady, her breath even. Karen had made one last mistake. She had assumed that getting inside meant she had won. Victoria was about to prove just how wrong she was. Victoria pressed her back against the cold steel wall, listening. The dull thuds from the other side of the reinforced door came in steady, measured intervals. Not the frantic pounding of desperate intruders, but the controlled force of people who knew what they were doing. They had planned this, studied the layout, and somehow found their way into the maintenance tunnels, bypassing her external defenses without triggering the standard alarms. That alone confirmed what she already suspected. Karen had outside help. Someone who had either mapped out the old infrastructure or had the kind of expertise necessary to break into restricted spaces without setting off obvious warnings. Her mind worked fast, processing variables, recalculating risks. The bunker had 3 layers of security. The primary surface-level entry, the reinforced secondary doors leading to the main chamber, and the fail-safe lockdown protocol that could seal everything from the inside. The first 2 were already compromised. The third was her only remaining advantage. If Karen and her group reached the control hub before she could activate full lockdown, they would have unrestricted access to the bunker's ventilation, power, and security feeds. She could not allow that to happen. Another thud, then the sound of metal grinding against metal. They were using tools now, prying at the locks, testing for weak points. She exhaled slowly, shifting her grip on her firearm. She had trained for situations like this, but the difference between theoretical preparedness and real execution was always razor-thin. There was no backup team coming to assist, no reinforcements, no authority she could call. She was on her own, and every decision in the next few minutes would determine whether she held control or lost everything. She moved quickly, crossing the dimly lit hallway toward the emergency console mounted on the side wall. The screen flickered as she keyed in the override sequence, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The full lockdown sequence required exactly 90 seconds to complete, just enough time to seal every remaining access point, reroute power to the backup generator, and isolate the air circulation from external sources. It was an all-or-nothing maneuver. If she triggered it now, there would be no way back, no exit until she manually disengaged the system once the storm passed. The screen flashed "Initiate lockdown." She hesitated just for a fraction of a second, and that was when the explosion ripped through the lower corridor. The force of it sent a shock wave through the walls, shaking the reinforced structure as dust and debris rained from the ceiling. The blast was not large enough to breach the door, but it was powerful enough to damage the locking mechanism. A second later, the emergency lights flickered, shifting from steady red to a chaotic strobe of flashing amber. A system warning, a failure in structural integrity. They were inside. Victoria pivoted instantly, moving to the nearest defensive position as she pulled her sidearm into a ready stance. The door had not fully given way, but the hinges were compromised, the metal warped inward from the force of the blast. A few more strikes, and they would be through. Then she heard Karen's voice from the other side. Victoria. The name came slow, deliberate, with none of the hysteria from earlier, none of the entitled arrogance. Instead, it was calm, calculated. You do not want this to get worse. Open the door. Victoria did not answer. We're already inside, Karen continued, stepping closer. Her voice was muffled through the damaged steel but still carried a dangerous kind of certainty. You built this place for survival. You wanted to be prepared for worst-case scenarios. But you did not expect people like us, did you? Victoria's jaw tightened. We know the storm is getting worse, Karen went on. We know you cut the power, which means you have switched to backup reserves. How long do those last, Victoria? A few days, a week? What happens when the air filters need maintenance? What happens when you are down here alone with no way out? Victoria inhaled slowly, suppressing the flicker of frustration curling in her chest. Karen was stalling, giving her people time to regroup, to reposition, to press whatever remaining advantage they had. Here is the deal, Karen said, shifting tactics. You let us in, and we work this out like civilized adults. You keep acting like this is some kind of war, and we treat it like one. Victoria's fingers tightened around the grip of her gun. That was the truth of it, was it not? Karen was not asking. She was declaring intent. Victoria flicked the safety off her firearm. Decision made. She moved to the left side of the corridor, pressing her back against the wall, just as the final impact split the door open. The metal groaned, buckling inward as Karen's people forced their way through the opening. Weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the dim bunker light. The first man through, one of the newcomers, moved with the efficiency of someone used to breaching spaces, his eyes sweeping the room, his firearm raised in a trained stance. He was not here for intimidation. He was here to secure the area. Victoria waited exactly 1 second, then moved. She stepped from the shadows, catching the man mid-sweep, and fired once. A clean, precise shot to the shoulder. Not lethal, but enough to throw him off balance and send him staggering backward. His gun clattered against the concrete as he dropped hard, cursing in pain. Before the others could react, Victoria pivoted, sweeping her leg in a sharp, controlled arc, kicking the second intruder's weapon aside before slamming the reinforced grip of her firearm against his jaw. He crumpled, barely catching himself before hitting the floor. That left Karen. Victoria turned just as Karen fired. The shot was wild, poorly aimed in the chaos, but it forced Victoria to break her line of attack, diving behind the nearest cover as the bullet struck the panel behind her, sending sparks cascading into the air. Karen snarled, adjusting her grip. You just do not know when to quit, do you? Victoria did not respond. Instead, she moved fast, using the confusion to reposition, staying out of the direct line of fire as Karen's remaining backup scrambled for their fallen weapons. Then, just as they regained their bearings, the lockdown sequence finished. A low mechanical hum reverberated through the bunker as the final blast doors sealed shut, trapping them all inside. Victoria exhaled slowly. No turning back now. Karen stared at the reinforced entrance, then back at Victoria, realization dawning on her face like a slow-burning fuse. You locked us in, she whispered, disbelief twisting into rage. You actually locked us all in. Victoria's expression remained unreadable. You wanted in so badly, she said coolly. Now you get to see what surviving a real crisis looks like. Karen's eyes flicked to the control panel, but it was already too late. The storm outside was still raging, and now they were trapped together deep underground with no way out. The heavy blast doors sealed with a final echoing thud, the reinforced locking mechanisms grinding into place with an almost ominous finality. The temperature in the bunker felt like it dropped a degree, or maybe that was just the tension thickening the air. Karen's chest rose and fell with rapid, uneven breaths, her grip still tight around the gun she had barely been able to fire, her knuckles white with the realization that she was no longer in control of anything. The power had shifted completely, irreversibly, and the understanding of that fact played out across her face in slow-burning horror. Victoria, standing with her back straight, eyes cold and unreadable, barely looked at Karen before she turned toward the nearest control panel, bringing up the bunker's internal diagnostics. Her movements were controlled, deliberate. She did not rush. She did not need to. Karen and her people had wanted in so badly, had fought, threatened, and even detonated part of her structure to force their way inside. Now they had gotten exactly what they wanted. They had walked straight into a prison of their own making. Karen snapped first. You, she hissed, stepping forward, weapons still trembling in her grasp. You think this is some kind of sick joke? You just locked yourself in here with us. What the hell is wrong with you? Victoria did not glance up from the panel as she ran a diagnostic check on the air circulation systems, ensuring that everything remained stable. I'm not the one who blew a hole in my bunker, she said smoothly. That was all you. Karen's face twisted, her breathing ragged, her desperation bubbling just beneath the surface. You cannot keep us down here. Victoria's gaze finally flicked up, her expression unreadable. No. A thick silence settled between them, stretching unbearably long as Karen clenched her teeth, her fingers tightening around the gun. Behind her, Richard was still pressing a hand against his bleeding temple from where Victoria had struck him earlier. His eyes darted between her and the two incapacitated men on the floor. The hard muscle that Karen had brought with her was groaning, the one Victoria had shot pressing a trembling hand to his wounded shoulder, his breath shallow but controlled. He was trained. He knew how to handle pain, but he also knew that they were severely outmatched. He did not even try to reach for his weapon again. Karen, however, still clung to whatever delusions of authority she had left. You think this means you win, she spat, her voice gaining back some of its usual venom. You think just because you trapped us down here, you get to call the shots. Victoria tilted her head slightly, considering the question like it was a genuine thought worth entertaining. Then, after a deliberate pause, she shrugged. Yes. Karen let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking her head as if trying to convince herself that this was not happening, that she could still salvage whatever plan she had. No, you do not. You are outnumbered. Victoria let her words sit for a moment, then glanced at the two men writhing in pain on the ground, then at Richard, who looked like he had already checked out of this disaster completely, then at the wounded mercenary still trying to regulate his breathing. Then she turned back to Karen. Are you sure about that? Karen hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. Enough for doubt to creep in, for the reality of the situation to dig its claws into whatever fantasy she had spun in her head about how this was all supposed to go. That hesitation was all Victoria needed. She moved fast, closing the space between them before Karen could react, before she could raise the gun properly. Victoria's hand clamped around Karen's wrist, twisting with just enough force to disarm her without breaking bone. The gun clattered uselessly to the ground. Karen stumbled, trying to reclaim some footing, but Victoria had already shoved her back, her body slamming against the steel bulkhead. The wind momentarily knocked out of her lungs. She gasped, eyes wide, stunned not just by the force of the attack, but by how fast it had happened, how little control she had left. Victoria stepped back, allowing Karen a second to recover, her own stance perfectly still, like a predator waiting to see if its prey had any fight left. Karen's breathing was uneven, her face flushed with humiliation, but she did not try to reach for the gun again. Good. Victoria bent down, picked up the weapon, and removed the magazine, tossing it across the room. The gun itself, now useless, she threw into the far corner, out of everyone's reach. She turned to the others, her expression unreadable. Here is what is going to happen. Richard flinched slightly at the tone, his hand still raised in a subconscious attempt to appear as non-threatening as possible. The mercenary kept his expression blank, but Victoria could see the calculations running through his head, the subtle way his eyes flicked to the door, to the vent system, analyzing potential exits. There is no way out until I say there is a way out. You damaged the primary access point with your stun upstairs, and the emergency overrides are only accessible from the main system, which I control. That means we all stay here until I decide otherwise. She let that sink in, watching as the weight of it settled onto their shoulders. And since you have already proved that you cannot be trusted with weapons, you will not be getting them back. If I catch any of you trying to get creative, I will make sure you regret it. Karen scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. Oh, please. What are you going to do? Lock us in separate rooms? Starve us out? She was trying to sound mocking, dismissive, but there was a nervous edge to it now, a thin veil over the fact that she was not as confident as she wanted to be. Victoria did not rise to the bait. You want it in, she said instead, her voice calm, level. Now you get to see what survival actually looks like. She turned, walking back toward the control panel, tapping a sequence into the console. The lights dimmed slightly, shifting to low-energy mode, a clear sign that resources would now be rationed under her terms. The air circulation adjusted just subtly enough that they would feel the change, a reminder that every breath they took was dependent on her. Karen did not speak again. Victoria sat down in the chair at the main station, crossing one leg over the other, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, watching, waiting. Because this was not over. Not yet. They still had hours to go before the storm outside passed. And down here, Victoria was about to find out who was truly prepared for the long haul. The hours dragged on in an unbearable, suffocating silence. The storm outside still howled, its winds shaking the reinforced structure of the bunker. But inside, it was deadly still. The kind of stillness that made every breath sound too loud, every movement feel like a threat. Victoria remained seated at the control panel, her eyes flicking between the security monitors and the people trapped inside with her. None of them spoke, at least not yet. The weight of their situation had settled over them like a dense fog, pressing into their bones, forcing them to sit with the consequences of their choices. Karen had slumped against the far wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her body wound tight with barely restrained frustration. Richard had retreated to a corner, his back pressed against the steel bulkhead, his eyes darting between the others like a man trying to figure out who was going to snap first. The wounded mercenary sat on the floor, his shoulders still bleeding sluggishly, his jaw clenched against the pain. But he remained quiet, disciplined. He knew how to endure. The other two, still dazed from Victoria's earlier counterattack, had finally stopped groaning, though they had not tried to move much beyond shifting into more comfortable positions. Victoria knew what they were all thinking. They were waiting for her to speak first, to offer them a way out, to tell them how this would end. She was not going to. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle into their skin, let the isolation of the bunker become real to them in a way that no amount of Karen's arrogance or misplaced sense of control could deny. She wanted them to feel it, to understand exactly what they had forced themselves into. This was not a power struggle anymore. This was survival. And the only person in the room who knew how to survive was her. The first crack came from Richard. His voice was low, hesitant, the bravado he had carried earlier stripped away by exhaustion and the growing fear of the unknown. "How long are you planning to keep us here?" Victoria did not look at him immediately. She let the question linger in the air before she finally turned her head, her expression unreadable. "Until the storm clears." Richard swallowed. "And then what?" Victoria tilted her head slightly, considering the question like it actually mattered. "Then I will decide what to do with you." Karen let out a sharp, bitter laugh, though there was no real humor in it. "Listen to you," she sneered, her voice hoarse but still clinging to that last shred of defiance. "Acting like some dictator in your little underground kingdom. You really think this changes anything? That when we get out of here, you're just going to go back to living your little isolationist fantasy? You have no idea what you have done." Victoria met Karen's glare with a cool, unwavering stare. "What I have done? Karen, I did not invite you here. You broke in. You brought explosives. You tried to take something that was not yours. And now you are upset that it did not go the way you planned? That is not my problem. That is yours." Karen's jaw tightened, but for once, she had nothing to say. Victoria leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed but her presence still commanding. "Here is how this is going to work," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I have supplies. I have control over the air, the power, and the locks. You do not. You will sit here, and you will wait. When the storm passes, I will open the doors, and you will leave. If you try anything between now and then, I will make sure you regret it." The threat was not spoken with malice or dramatics. It was a simple, undeniable fact. Karen pressed her lips together, fury burning behind her eyes, but she did not argue.